Good morning, everyone. I call the session of the Public Service Commission to order. Madam Secretary, are there any changes to the final agenda?
There are no changes to the final agenda.
Thank you. First, I'll conduct a roll call of commissioners. When I call your name, please confirm that you are with us. Commissioner Berman.
Present.
Commissioner Alisi.
Present.
Commissioner Edwards.
Present.
Commissioner Howard.
Present.
Commissioner Valesky.
Present.
Commissioner Majori.
Present.
Thank you, and I hear you loud and clear in New York. We'll move to the regular agenda. Our first item for discussion today, item 301, case 20-E-0197, as it relates to the petition identifying areas of concern, transmission needs, and recommended solutions. It will be presented today by Elizabeth Grisaru, Deputy Director of Office of Electric, Gas, and Water. Accompanying her will be Marianne Sorrentino, Jerry Ancona, and Jalila Alisi. Ms. Grisaru, please begin.
Good morning, Chair Christian and Commissioners. We are very pleased to be here with you today on this item. The draft order that is now before you would approve an approximately $4.4 billion investment in local transmission upgrades required to meet our state's 2030 climate targets. These upgrade projects arise out of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, which was signed into law in April of 2020. Under this statute, the legislature directed the Commission to identify the transmission upgrades that are needed to meet the climate goals established in the 2019 Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, often referred to as the CLCPA. As you and the other commissioners know, the CLCPA sets mandatory targets for decarbonizing the state's economy and schedules for achieving those objectives. As required by the legislature, the Commission initiated the present proceeding in May of 2020 and began planning the transmission needed to support CLCPA targets. Following the recommendations of the January 2021 Power Grid study, the Commission has pursued two primary efforts. First, upgrading infrastructure to meet the 2030 targets for renewable generation, and second, developing a coordinated planning process to identify the transmission investments that will be needed in the longer term. To date, the Commission has approved the development of a number of local upgrades that support our 2030 goals in the category we call Phase 1 projects. These are projects that are needed to maintain the reliability and safety of the utility systems, but also add headroom for renewable generation. In addition, the Commission directed the utilities to propose criteria for making investments in the category of Phase 2 local transmission projects, that is, the upgrades that are primarily driven by CLCPA needs. While that work is ongoing today, the Commission recognized in a September 2021 order that upgrades were urgently needed in 3 regions of the state where the growth in renewable generation has exceeded the capacity of the grid. And if we could turn to the slide here, that would be helpful. Those 3 regions are illustrated in this slide that you see here. For shorthand, we refer to them here and in the draft order as the areas of concern, and that is the 3 regions that are outlined in this map in red. These 3 areas represent a major portion of the state's investment in renewable generation. Measuring the pace of development by the generation projects that are under contract with our sister agency, NYSERDA, these regions include 85% of all contracted projects that are currently operational and 45% of all projects that have received contract awards but are at some earlier stage in their development. Developer interest in these regions has been very strong in the past and continues to be strong looking toward the future. However, the limitations of the transmission system in these regions are affecting the operations of the generation. When the system is congested, generation is curtailed to avoid reliability violations and damage to utility equipment. As additional generation projects come online and compete for the limited transmission capacity, the congestion problem increases, leading to more curtailments and deteriorating economic conditions for generation project developers and owners. In the same September 2021 order, the Commission directed the utilities operating in these regions to file proposals for upgrades that would improve the capacity of their systems to manage both the existing and future renewable generation. The three utilities, National Grid, NYSEG RG&E, and Central Hudson, filed local transmission solutions in March of 2022. Staff has reviewed those proposed upgrades and recommends approval of 62 projects at an estimated cost of approximately $4.4 billion. These projects would provide over 3 gigawatts of additional headroom to the existing system and are planned to enter service later in this decade, reducing the congestion that existing generation is already experiencing and providing capacity for additional projects that are under contract with NYSERDA in time for the 2030 goals. The actual costs of these investments would be recovered from all ratepayers in the state through the load ratio share methodology that the Commission approved in the same September 2021 order. The practical effect of this approach is that rates would gradually increase as each project is built and comes into service. Staff estimates that assuming all of these upgrades are in service in 2030, rates would increase by approximately 6 mils per kilowatt hour. Staff estimates that customers' total bills would rise between 3 and 16%, depending on their service classifications and locations. The eventual recovery of these costs would flow through a new NYSO tariff rate schedule once any given project's costs have been approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. While we do not know today what the final costs of these projects will be, staff intends to scrutinize the company's expenditures on a regular basis consistent with their existing practices and will participate in the FERC proceedings to ensure that incurred costs are reasonable and prudent. In addition, under the funding agreement approved earlier by the Commission, the utilities' return on these investments will be limited to the lower of the FERC rate or the rate approved by this Commission in the applicable rate cases. We note, as is explained in the draft order, that these transmission upgrades would help reduce other costs that ratepayers are exposed to. Specifically, the cost of the curtailment risk that generation developers now face. When developers cannot accurately predict their revenues due to transmission system limitations, they are forced to raise their prices that they bid in the NYSERDA procurements. Absent any transmission upgrades, ratepayers would pay this curtailment-influenced price over the 20-year term of the resulting NYSERDA contracts. While staff recommends you approve this significant transmission investment, we caution that even this package does not guarantee that additional upgrades will not be needed as we progress toward the state's renewable generation targets. Staff took an independent look at the utilities' assessment of the generation development potential in these areas of concern and concluded that the proposed upgrades reflect a very conservative view of that potential. The utilities' proposals are based on a snapshot of the generation that they deemed likely to be constructed that was taken in November of 2021 when they began designing the transmission solutions now before you. However, we know that since that moment in time, the pool of generation projects that are in advanced development has grown larger. Thus, we expect that the Commission will need to revisit transmission system needs in the areas of concern at some point in the future. It is our expectation that the results of the coordinated grid planning process, which the Commission initiated earlier in this proceeding, will help us inform those future investment decisions. Thank you, and I and my colleagues are happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Grisaro. I have a question. You mentioned that the projects would be reviewed in accordance with existing practices. Would you be so kind as to elaborate on what you mean by that?
Yes, our staff does examine utility capital expenditures following the rate case process, and my understanding is that we will apply essentially the same approach here,
So we'll review it like we would a normal
just
rate
as we
case.
would in a normal rate case process, right?
Got it. Just wanted to clarify. You also said that this is going to meet our 2030 anticipated needs based on the 2021 forecast, and the CGGP is going to be helpful in getting us beyond that. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, thanks. Just wanted to make sure I was clear on that point. So again, thank you for your presentation. I'm happy to see this project before us today. This is an offshoot, as you mentioned, of the Accelerated Renewable Energy Growth and Community Benefit Act, and the Commission is moving forward with the directive assigned to us at that time to identify the various transmission needs needed to meet the CLCPA goals. We understand that to successfully decarbonize, we need to have a robust transmission system. And I'm encouraged that these investments will not only help us achieve that goal, but help secure New York's role as a leader in clean energy going forward. So thank you, and I look forward to supporting this project. Commissioner Berman.
Thank you so much. I do appreciate it. I also appreciate that your presentation today did talk about the fact that we're not quite sure on the final costs, and that in fact there may be significant uncertainty on that. Can you talk a little bit? Are we looking at perhaps potentially increased costs, and who bears that risk?
Sure, I'd be happy to. The utilities themselves advise in the petition that their cost estimates are based on a pretty significant certainty band that goes from minus 25 to plus 50. That's a typical range of uncertainty that we see in capital proposals in the rate case context, for example. So, using the utilities cost band, these cost estimates could range from 3.3, which would be on the lower end, to 6.6 billion. That's the result of simply applying the uncertainty band. So costs could go higher. Even the utilities agree that costs could go lower. I think does that answer your question?
Yes, I guess I am really concerned about the potential for the increased costs to be 50% more, perhaps. Is that what I heard you say?
That's the uncertainty range that the utilities provided, and as I said, that we typically work with at this stage of project development before the utilities have done the more intensive project design and engineering work. There's significant uncertainty about the final cost.
Right. And I do understand that we're looking at staff keeping on top of the potential costs through a similar way of looking at the review done during the rate case. My concern is that it is outside of the rate case. And so while it may be following the model or attempting to follow the model of the rate case, there are not necessarily the same level of due diligence review that may be in the rate case, especially when you have a lot of folks being able to look at that, the process that is developed, the incorporation of an administrative law judge, incorporation of what that looks like from a prudency review, and also how you deal with the accounting issue, especially when you're looking at CapEx projects, and perhaps the concern if it's can be very detrimental to ratepayers if not done right. And I don't necessarily feel comfortable with just hearing that staff will do their due diligence. I have no doubt staff will attempt to. I just think that this can be a very daunting process, and we're not talking about a small number of things. If I remember correctly, the utilities initially, when we were talking about phase 2, they had actually expressed interest in having the phase 2 projects to be done in the rate cases, and the commission as a whole had decided that it would be done outside of that. Can you speak a little bit about that?
Yes, although that discussion isn't directly applicable here. At an earlier stage, the commission did find that getting its arms around CLCPA-driven local transmission needs required establishing a new forum outside the rate case where the commission could undertake that sort of cross-coordinated view, which again is the theme of behind the coordinated grid planning process. So in a sense, those two things come together. So we are anticipating that the utilities are under a directive to make a phase 2 filing together, and that filing, which was originally due this January, has been extended, I believe, to the beginning of March. So that will be the first time that the commission undertakes this coordinated process for the review of the coordinated phase 2 portfolio.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. When I look, I also look at what is our obligation? What is our process that we have to ensure that we are making sure that this is serving the public need? And I also am looking at whether or not what we're doing today is appropriate and if there are any alternatives ways of doing this. I recognize that I have a history of voting no over concerns with phase 1 and the different projects in there and the issues surrounding how we do the load forecasting. For me, I also am mindful that my votes, when the majority of the commission votes to do it a certain way, and then I may vote no at that time, that I have an obligation to also incorporate that in my analysis and to recognize that the majority has spoken, and then to look at whether or not in the facts and circumstances in the record before us, if it's for me to also continue and to figure out what the appropriate action should be. I do believe that we have an obligation also in regulation to not be static and not to be open to making appropriate due diligent changes if the way we thought initially in something needs to be changed. I am concerned that we have backed ourselves in as a commission as a whole to orders when we initially kicked this off, that if we had, with foresight, would have done it differently from the beginning. I also believe that we have an opportunity when we are looking at what this looks like, especially with the ongoing coordinated grid planning process, that we perhaps, if necessary in this case, make some modifications to that and not get stuck with, well, this is how we have to be because this is how we thought we were going to do it initially. I don't see that evolution of thought process in what's before us today. In fact, I see us still stuck in trying to stick to not just the legislature, but to how we initially approached it, which I think, frankly, may need some refining. And I also think that the refining doesn't mean that it would upend the process. We're looking at the phase 2 now. We're looking at significant ratepayer impact. And we're looking at uncertainty on what this means going forward. The way the order is written, it appears to suggest, excuse me, and I don't want to misspeak, so. as it talks about ratepayer impacts, it says this order is being issued by the Commission pursuant to the requirements under Section 7.3 of the Accelerated Renewables Act to identify local transmission upgrades that are necessary or appropriate to achieve the CLCPA under a prioritized schedule upon which such upgrades shall be accomplished. I agree. That is what we're trying to do. Having found that the projects at issue are justified, I don't agree. It remains incumbent on the Commission to maintain transparency with respect to the potential cost impacts of the areas of concern projects on ratepayers. I'm going to repeat that. It remains incumbent on the Commission to maintain transparency with respect to the potential cost impacts of the area of concern projects on ratepayers. And I think you attempt to do that by acknowledging openly that there are significant costs and we're not necessarily sure about the final costs. And I appreciate that. I think that's a really important thing. The order then goes on to say, though, that however, we would be remiss if we did not also consider the costs to ratepayers should we fail to take action to address the transmission constraints in the areas of concern associated with delivering renewable energy to the load. I have a huge issue with that. The theme I've been hearing in a lot of different dockets and sort of at the state as a whole is this failure to take action. And I take pause on that. What does that mean, failure to take action? I don't mean to suggest that we failed to take action. In fact, that's, for me, that section is really important on ratepayer impacts. It is not enough for us to have a word salad that does not go into detail on what else are the potential alternatives. What was the legal analysis? What was the policy analysis? How would we also address this perhaps and have options for us as a commission to look at? The pros and the cons, the different things. Multiple interveners, LIPA, and others suggest different opportunities, right? We are deciding that these projects are justified and therefore we're all in, rather than saying, what I think is that we're looking at this, we're evaluating, we're seeing what's still missing, we're seeing the potential, challenges that have technical implications, have developer implications, have cost implications, and perhaps we need to be mindful that this and what we're doing here is not the only things that are adding costs and issues onto the system. So the alignment between all of the different standard things that are required for us to do in reliability and safety and our core mission have to also get pancaked on when we look at the CLCPA and those requirements. But we have to do it in a way that makes sense. Now, I believe strongly that we all agree that achieving the mandates of the Climate Act and the Accelerated Renewables Act require major investments in transmission and distribution infrastructure, in addition to investments in renewable generation to ensure the system of the future serves New Yorkers in a reliable and cost-effective manner. I think we all agree to that. And we as a commission has focused so far on upgrades to our local transmission facilities that are needed to support state climate goals for 2030. In addition, we've addressed a need for additional bulk transmission related to offshore wind integration. And as we talked about here, for the longer term, we are looking at developing a coordinated state planning process to identify grid investments needed to meet the state's CLCPA mandates and ensure the commission and electric utilities are equipped to respond to system need in a timely and responsible manner. Through this process, we, along with the electric utilities and other utilities and the ISO and a whole host of other stakeholders, are going to need to make sure that we're aligning our thinking, our procedures, incorporating any necessary modifications to provide the commission with a complete view of both the bulk and the local transmission needs as they evolve. And so for me, what I recognize is this is difficult. I recognize that we are going to have challenges. I recognize that if it was a purely market-based generation market, the transmission investment would be done solely by the developers. But since the state has largely taken over resource decisions, the idea is to have the ratepayers pick up the tab directly. And that's challenging when we're talking about such a large amount. And when it's being done outside of the rate case, it requires also a lot of concern, a lot of more coordination, and then figuring out. So I guess the fundamental question is, how do the most cost-effective solutions rise to the top? When do we act on them? How do we act on them? How do we put in the barriers that we need? And if we are preordaining the utility plans and expenditures here, what do we do when we are still so uncertain? I don't feel that the process has been laid out enough to ensure that this record is sufficient, and in fact, I think it's deficient in showcasing that this action is what we should be doing today. When we're looking at the cost issue, I also have, for me, a concern. So part of what we've talked about also is that there's a lot of developers interested. That's a good thing, right? We have a lot of interest. And we're looking at those projects that are further in development, perhaps, right? So we're only really partially solving the problem for some folks today, but we're not solving for those developers further out in the development stage. How does it come back to the commission if the costs are so out of skew? How do we, if we're saying that they're necessary, how do we make sure that we are truly looking at that? Now, ACE New York has a letter that they submitted seeking to renegotiate contracts based on inflation and asking for a significant portion of those contracts to perhaps to be renegotiated. Will those types of things come back to the commission to weigh in on whether it's appropriate? Should we be looking at perhaps what the commission should be saying organically, generically, so that folks have regulatory certainty in what that looks like? When we say the staff is going to be tasked with evaluating the costs, what lens do we look at? What lens do we give you so that there's certainty around what that looks like? Some of these projects may not get built in the near term. So if the costs, supply chain, and all a host of other things, inflation, or if all of that goes up, what are we saying? There's no trigger, perhaps, except to do what? That's what I'm asking. Explain to me the process for me to feel comfortable that we as a commission are sending the right signals.
Of course, this is hard. I think there's some language in the draft order that acknowledges the very difficult situation that the commission is in, because it's a very difficult exercise to try to predict what market forces, which is what drive the generation development. What will be the intersection of those market forces and the more heavily regulatorily driven infrastructure development? We don't know where the generation developers are going to go. We don't know exactly how quickly they're going to show up or exactly where. how do we tackle that problem? And what the commission did in this case, and this is not the blueprint for phase 2 projects in general. As I mentioned earlier, the commission told the utilities to go back to the drawing board with their proposal for benefit cost analysis and other criteria that we will be applying into future phase 2 filings. So this particular case, given the urgency of the congestion problem, is sort of on its own model. But that model addresses the uncertainty essentially by trying to box the risk of overbuilding transmission infrastructure, which of course is the scenario that we want to avoid. And I think staff is quite confident that the methodology applied here and the record before you show that this particular package of upgrades does not raise much risk at all of overbuilding transmission infrastructure. Rather, we have less confidence that you won't have a problem in the future because this package is very conservative. It's based on a very conservative snapshot of the generation potential. And so the risk of underbuilding in this instance is probably greater than the risk of overbuilding. But in the immediate term, I think staff is very confident that the package here is appropriate to the defined needs of the system, and in that sense is cost effective. And there may be more buried in your question, but I wanted to make that point.
No, thank you. I appreciate that, Liz. I think the reality, though, is that there are valid concerns. There is significant uncertainty. I don't see us as a commission really addressing the specific needs in terms of what the staff who are going to have to go to FERC should be looking at from the commission as a body, what it means in terms of this potential, if it is increasing the costs, or even just staying the same. It's a significant dollar amount. And it is not that I say we should not move forward quickly and efficiently and responsibly on transmission. But it is for us to look at what are some of the alternatives and the options. And I do think that when you look at the record does not necessarily give to the commission an opportunity for alternatives. So that section that talks about ratepayer impacts has only lip service by saying, we're doing this, we think it's justified, and if we fail to take action, and no one is suggesting that we fail to take action, but we should be measured. We should be looking at it, perhaps today as a framework to say what we're looking at, what we care about, but then moving some of the actual specifics in terms of what it looks like, directing more analysis and modeling that can give us a more certainty on the costs, directing some kind of evaluation, especially in light of the uncertainty with whether there's going to be renegotiating on contracts that are already existing, what it is that we are saying about that, what it is about how it may come back to the commission or not. And then also looking at folding into that some insight into what we should be requiring for the coordinated grid planning process, which is underway. And so, as I sit here, these concerns, the lack of certainty, the lack of direction to staff on what is required, and how it sort of then would then be outside of the commission without necessarily being able to make timely modifications and have proper analysis is enough for me to say that this does not serve the public need. It is not consistent with the long-term plans to improve reliability and transmission capabilities. and it will not help to accommodate future expansion of the clean energy grid. In fact, it might be a part of that, but as a whole, this is not the right approach. And so I would like us to look at this more in not just trying to push it all out. I think that is short-sighted and that is complicated, and it will cause us to have more challenges than if we just gave some analysis and direction now on what we need to have the proper fiscal fiduciary oversight. And I worry that we are going to regret this today. So based on that, I will be voting no, based on the fact that I think the record is insufficient in showcasing that this action today should be taken, but it is not saying that I think we should take no action. I think we should be sending different signals and giving more clarity, which is lacking here. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Alisi?
Thank you, Chairman. And thanks to all of the people in the department. We had the benefit of a couple of briefings, and I know an awful lot of work went into that. So thank you for that. What we're doing is we're responding to a pressing need that is directly related to the demands of the CLCPA, which is law. Our pursuit of renewable energy will not come without cost. Appropriately, this approach allows for costs to be spread statewide, and I know that that will make some people unhappy, but I would point out that when we were sending transmission from the north down to the metropolitan area, those same complaints were heard by different sectors of our population. So there's a matter of fairness in here that I don't see is coming from this report. That's my editorial version. The higher cost of no curtailment approach makes sense to me because most likely it will provide more near-term headroom, and it will also support longer-term renewable development planning. My greatest concern is unknown future costs. As an aside, I remember 12 years ago when I was underground at the 2nd Avenue subway that had been under construction for many years, with completion being promised and moving the ball forward and forward and forward. We all know that it didn't happen in the 2 years that it was supposed to have happened since my visit down there. It is now open, however, and that's the good news. It just came a little late. $4.4 billion is where we're going with what's before us today. What remains unknown is where we'll be and where we'll end up in the future. And nevertheless, this is the path that we have chosen. We must accommodate the law as it has been presented to us by the legislature, and I'll be voting yes.
Commissioner, if I could just, perhaps this is helpful for everyone. There are at least two more touch points where we will see the costs of these projects as they evolve. The first one is in the Article 7 process, which happens here in-house. We will get updated cost estimates from all of these project developers, utilities in this case, as they seek those Article 7 certificates. Secondly, as I mentioned earlier, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission will be sort of sitting in our shoes in the future, scrutinizing the actual costs that the utilities file with them. They will be sort of wearing our hat, or will be sharing a hat at that point. And their process is no less robust, no less intensive than ours. And we will be, as I said, staff will be intervening in those proceedings to make sure our voice is heard and that FERC understands our position. on the reasonableness and prudence of the costs as the utilities report them. So there will be at least those 2 additional touch points on these costs going forward.
Thank you for that additional commentary. All right, we'll move on now to Commissioner Edwards.
I have no comments. Thank you. I'll be voting in favor.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Howard.
Thank you. Thank you. And Liz, Marianne, and team, thank you. There's some aspects of this order as presented to us that I find gratifying, particularly our emphasis on price transparency, which, as you know, well, my belief is it has not been so transparent in other orders in the past. So to that end, I do thank you for that analysis, not just when we speak, and we typically speak of statewide impacts. I really do appreciate the individual LDC, customer impact by company and rate class. I have a couple questions. You know, it's in relation to the FERC oversight. Is it fair to say that FERC is typically more generous in rate of return than this commission?
I think that is a common assumption, Commissioner. Don't personally know all the history. Others in this room are probably better able to answer the precise question, but I think that is generally true. On the other hand, under the cost recovery mechanism that will be in place for these costs, the utilities have agreed to use the return and capital structure approved by this commission in their FERC filings. So there will be that limitation on what they submit to FERC. Do you want to?
They're actually bound by the lower of this commission's allowed rate of return, or return on equity and capital structure, and the FERC return on equity and capital structure in their filing at the FERC that was approved.
Great, thank you. Because certain past orders we've done on transmission, the owners have been granted higher ROIs than we typically do.
Not here.
Okay, great. And is by your map, it would appear that the owners, we make reference to the utilities, but we're really talking about National Grid and the Avangrid companies. Is that fair to say in terms of where
and
these
Central
first
Hudson.
and Central Hudson?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And this will help provide a significant increase in their overall CapEx, correct? The values of the companies will increase significantly because they're building new stuff.
Yes.
So
hopefully attracts more investors.
So for their shareholders and bondholders is a good thing.
I would say
Potentially.
so. Yeah.
Okay, great. As you probably, and staff already knows, I'm not going to be supporting this, not because of the issue of the need for more transmission to accommodate new renewables into the system. It's my ongoing, and unfortunately, I sound like I use the phrase broken record, but anybody under 40 doesn't even know what a record is. This has been my ongoing complaint. It's the nature of the load share ratio recovery and how we're charged across the state. It is particularly not ironic, it's just right there in the face that those customers who have the least carbon impact on the state will be paying nearly double as compared to those customers that have the highest carbon impact in the state. I'll just use the example, Con Ed, a largely 90+% carbon-based company currently versus NIMO and NYSEG, which is far less in terms of where the actual electrons come from. It'll be nearly double. It'll be nearly double the impact on those. This is per the chart that you provided the commission. Additionally, the issue of within rate classes. You know, I just recently came back from the NARU conference where I'll tell you, there are about 30 some odd states that use us as an example of come to my state, we won't bang you for higher costs. Come here and build your new widget factory or whatever. And they are blatantly use our state as an example of something that they wouldn't do. You know, to that end, you know, the commercial and industrial portion of this is significant. And in terms of if I was a site selector and going and trying to decide where I was going to build my new establishment, I would have to look at where my long-term costs were on a very important aspect of my business. So in some cases, you know, again, the high load factor industries are the most glaring, and we don't have that many. If we keep going this way, we will have none. In some cases, and this is if the projects don't exceed what we think they are. If we give them another 50% wiggle room, that's a big wiggle, it could be significantly higher dollars over time. And, you know, a double-digit, you know, rate increase, bill increase, or in this case, rate increases, you know, is very troubling. The other thing, and I know the commission, the staff is poised in the next several months to give us a complete analysis of the overall cost of CLCPA compliance, and I look forward to that, because to do these one-off, and then one-off's the wrong, pardon me, don't be to be pejorative, these the way we do it, to me, it masks the entire cost of decarbonization. This is just one aspect that could add, you know, up to, you know, 4% in some cases for residential costs and 10% for certain large industrials. But that's not the only thing we're doing. And this is only on the transmission side. Those same developers are developing stuff that will also cost ratepayers money. Again, to develop those renewable rate resources. So, you know, we are looking at some big numbers down the road, and again, that the issue of equity is very important. I don't believe that the load share ratio is in any way equitable, because those customers that are causing the problem are the ones that seem to be getting the better deal, and I'm very, very troubled by that. You know, and in regard to this, you know, there's been much talk lately about making New York more affordable. I don't think raising commercial industrial rates by nearly double digit makes New York more affordable. And as we have now known, any upward pressure on residential rates, you know, we have just done the last hour, we did gave a lot of ratepayer money to people to help them relieve them of their bills. If we have more upward pressure on cost of bills, that's just, again, we know what happens. People don't pay. We have to come up with an arrears program or some other mechanism by which to make the utilities whole for products that they have sold. So I think, you know, that's one of the things that go. I also found it very interesting in this week that during the budget hearings that the chairman did an able job at. I appreciate his efforts. But certain advocates pointed out that in this year's budget, there is no dollars to help transmission owners. And even though that certain advocates said, we're going to spend a lot of money here. We really need to help customers, because, you know, currently the only mechanism to pay for all this is through utility rates exclusively. And I just have to say, and I feel compelled to say this, when asked that question, and the governor's office responded by such that state budget does not include funding for transmission infrastructure. Utilities typically pay for the cost of power infrastructure, including transmission lines. These costs are passed to utility ratepayers through the delivery charge for electric service. Well, in this case, we now know what that number is. And I'm making the broad assumption that these rate increases are now somehow broadly acceptable as an effort to part of our decarbonization efforts. And I will submit that the financing them exclusively through rates, particularly for residential, is the least progressive mechanism for financing anything. We make no judgment whether you have the money to pay or you don't have the money to pay. And on the commercial and industrial side, whether this puts you out of industrial competitiveness, you go out of, with your peers. It is just completely, the rhetoric doesn't match the actual effort that we're doing here today. And I do understand where we are. There is no other mechanism to pay for these investments. I got it. Again, at some point, this really gets out of hand. And as I said, and I really look forward to what it means in context of all the other CLCPA mandated it's not mandated spending, it's things that we will have to do to make sure that we meet the 2030 and 2040 goals. So I think that is it's still so troubling to me. And it's also a lot of the advocates also pointed out polluters should pay. Polluters should pay. And in this case, the ratepayers who pollute the less pay the most. It is really troubling in terms of carbon impact. And that's that. And to me, the saddest part of what we're doing today is that no one will know. No one will pay attention. No one will know that upstate ratepayers are potentially having higher impacts than downstate ratepayers. They won't know. This will not appear in the Syracuse, Rochester, or Buffalo media. They won't know. Decision makers at all levels just won't know. And it will be after the bill impacts hit, and I guarantee you when these costs hit our rate cases, the howl from these same constituencies will be heard from here to Timbuktu. But this is what we're doing. And again, I know they're all reconciled later, but again, we are incurring the cost today. And it's not that I'm against, I just have to say this again. It is not that I am personally against how the need to decarbonize our system rapidly and efficiently. It's just the way we're paying for it. If we believe that these large capital expenses are absolutely necessary as a part of state policy, then the state legislature needs to help pay for them, not us. Because the members of this body, we become the de facto tax raisers to implement public policy. So again, I do appreciate your work very much and your candor, and particularly the candor in regard to, as Commissioner Alisi pointed out, there is some upside. There's risk, real risk going forward that these numbers could be significantly higher. But to that end, I do appreciate your work. But given the nature of how we're doing this, I will not be supporting it. So thank you very much, Mr.
Let me just make one comment, if that's okay. So it goes to your question of ratepayers upstate paying more money for these projects than downstate ratepayers. And it could just go to confusion between tables 6 and 7 in the order. In actuality, ratepayers in each classification will pay the identical amount no matter where located in the state. Table 7 shows the issue in terms of a percentage, and the percentages are different just simply because downstate rates are much higher than upstate rates. And so the percentage increase is lower downstate than the percentage increase in upstate New York. But otherwise, just to be clear, ratepayers
No,
in each
I appreciate that,
classification
but
are
I
gonna
do
pay the
have to,
identical amount.
I do have to respond to the delta.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Valesky?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Liz, great job by you and your team as always. There's a lot that went into this. This is obviously a very, very significant item that is before us today, and I appreciate your work. Appreciate your openness and honesty in your presentation. Certainly, in regard to this, may not be the end of the line, so to speak. So thank you for that. I just and I will be supporting the item. I just want to make one observation as I was preparing for today's session and to consider this order. It seems to me as the state, as we march along the path toward decarbonization, we have this delicate balance or equilibrium that we're trying to find between generation of renewables and transmission of the power that comes from those renewables. On the generation side, lots of progress. Our sister agency at NYSERDA, I think, has done a good job in terms of them leading that effort. We now have been hearing additional proposals going back a year or so, perhaps to change things on the generation side and include others in that process. That is neither for today or for us to consider, certainly, but I just make the observation that we can continue to move forward on the generation side all we want, but if we don't have the transmission to get what is generated from renewable generation projects, well, where are we going to be in the final analysis? So, not a lot of talk on the transmission side, but this is just as important as anything else along our path toward decarbonization. So I see this order as, in a sense, a rebalancing of that equation, or maybe a catching up, if you will, on the transmission side with the generation side. And in that regard, I think this is an incredibly important item that we consider today. And I also appreciate specifically, Liz, your response to, I believe it was one of Commissioner Berman's questions. I think you and the staff have taken the absolute correct approach when you said, and I'm paraphrasing, this is in terms of the issue of overbuilding versus underbuilding, this is the most conservative approach. I think that's absolutely the right approach that we should be taking. So again, thank you for coming at this from that perspective. And again, I'll be supporting the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Majori?
Thank you. So several of my colleagues raised some very serious issues that I've been wrestling with in my own mind. And last night, as I was doing my final preparations for today's meeting, I took a walk around Manhattan as the sun was going down, and I couldn't help but notice that it was about 65 degrees. And it sort of reminded me of the context of why the legislature passed the CLCPA in the first place. And it made me think a little bit about that law, which, reasonable people could disagree about whether or not it was the best way to deal with the issue. I supported it. But it very clearly gives us, the PSC, mandates to come up with a program to establish that 70% of statewide electric generation must be produced by renewable energy by 2030, and that by 2040, the statewide electrical system must be zero emissions. The clock is ticking, and that's one of the things that I can't get around in my head. Now, in my mind, ideally, when the costs of such an enormous policy such as the CLCPA come into view, that the legislature would pass a budget appropriation to help achieve the statewide goals as articulated by that policy. And that given that our state income tax is graduated tax, with the wealthiest New Yorkers paying a higher tax rate, contributing more of the statewide tax revenue, that this approach would help ensure that those who can afford to pay for these important policy objectives that the method of paying is more closely matched with the ability to pay. The legislature has other options for progressive ways of raising revenue, Bond Act, creation of a wealth tax, and ideally, I would prefer that the legislature took that approach, but it's not what the legislature did. Instead, we were mandated to come up with the revenue, to come up with a way of generating revenue to pay for the infrastructure that's mandated by law. So the question for me is, how can we do this in an equitable way for ratepayers, or at least the most equitable way that is at our disposal to do? So we come to today's order, which we would not be contemplating if not for the CLCPA. This is not phase one. So the projects here are coming into existence in order to meet the statewide goals as articulated by the CLCPA. So I don't really like the load share ratio as a way to pay for this, but I can't get around in my head that these are statewide goals that we are trying to address. They're not local goals. And so I conclude that this is a justifiable way to pay for these infrastructure investments. I don't like increasing rates. I don't think anybody on this commission does. But as is evident by the order, there are enormous costs that are associated with achieving the statewide goals that are mandated by law. And so we have to, make a hard decision. I will note that the legislature has acknowledged that energy affordability is an issue. Last year, they enacted the $250 million. They passed $250 million onto the DPS to reduce utility arrears. I know the budget has another $200 million to expand affordability programs. Maybe the legislature will contemplate putting more money into that. These are not necessarily the methods that I would have preferred if I was in the legislature, but I'm not. I'm here. I'm on the PSC. I can't offer an amendment to create a wealth tax. What I could do is I could vote yes or no. And I think when I consider all the factors here, I arrive at the conclusion that I'm going to vote yes. So, the bottom line for me is that we have to comply with the statewide mandate for a program that benefits all New Yorkers. And I think that this is justifiable. Liz, I'd like to thank you and your team for a thorough presentation and an even more thorough order. And the order has an awful lot of information and answered a lot of my questions. So that's why I don't have any to ask. But I will be voting yes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Commissioner. Excuse me. My vote is in favor of the recommendations to grant a petition and approve the proposed transmission upgrades. As discussed, Commissioner Berman, how do you vote?
I will be issuing a separate written dissent to be attached to the order. My vote is a no.
Thank you. Commissioner Alisi?
Yes.
Commissioner Edwards?
Yes.
Commissioner Howard?
No.
Commissioner Valesky?
Yes.
Commissioner Majori?
Yes.
Thank you, everyone. The item is approved and the recommendations are adopted. We're now going to move to the consent agenda. Do any commissioners wish to comment on or recuse from voting on any items in the consent agenda? I'll start with Commissioner Berman.
I will be concurring on item 162. On item 164, I will be concurring, and I'd just like to say that my reason for my concurrence is I'm supportive of the item, but in the item on page 7, it talks about the fact that we will be requiring the initiation of a new proceeding wherein all gas distribution utilities in New York will confirm and report on the use of perimeter lock tapping tees in their service territories. And it goes into the fact that we'll be doing that new proceeding. And for me, I am supportive of a new proceeding, but I think that it should have a separate commencement order today, the commencement of the new proceeding order established. It can reference that it is doing that, but I don't think that it is procedurally fair or appropriate to just reference it in here without having established the commencement of a new proceeding by a separate written order. So I'm concurring, but I flag that as a process issue that I think is a problem.
Thank you, Commissioner. Let's discuss that offline after session as well. Thank you. Those are the two items, 162 and 164. Great. Thank you. Commissioner Alisi.
I'll be supporting the entire consent calendar.
Thank you. Commissioner Edwards.
No questions, no comments.
Thank you. Commissioner Howard.
Yes, I have one comment and one recusal. On item 162, the St. Lawrence Gas franchise extension. This is a 60-year franchise extension for a gas-only utility. I've discussed it, and my first blush was to be a hard no on this in regard that I don't see how we could reconcile a 60-year gas-only franchise with the goals of the CLCPA. But in discussion with council, I've been informed and that there is nothing, and as currently written in the CLCPA, that would bar this commission for extending gas franchises, whether it's 30 years, 60 years, a billion years. And while I do believe that that is in fact the case in their interpretation, there is no way that I believe that that action is in the spirit of the authors of the CLCPA. And I also would submit, since this is a small utility on the Canadian border, it goes under the radar. If this is in a more urbanized area with a greater level of activism, I believe there would have been more comments and potential opposition to this. In addition to the council's belief that the CLCPA does not disallow this action, it also points out to the actions of local governments, because what this order does is to verify actions of local governments who granted franchise agreements, in this case to the tune of 60 years. And again, to council's advice, there is nothing in the CLCPA that specifically says that local government actions need to be scrutinized by the CLCPA as currently written. We all know in this body that the CLCPA inevitably will have some amendments. When and how and what, we don't know yet, but it's clearly has some issues going forward. And I would suggest to those that are interested, this issue of gas franchise extensions may be one of the items that the legislature should take a look at and see how they align with the overall spirit of the CLCPA. But that being said, I'll be voting for it. I'm also, on the advice of Department Counsel, recusing myself from item 360.
Sorry, Commissioner
sorry.
Howard, could you confirm
Can you
that item
please-
number, please?
Yes.
360?
I think you, no,
You
I
mean
don't,
362 by chance?
Oh, excuse me. I'm sorry. 362. I apologize.
Thank you.
got it. Thank you, Commissioner. Commissioner Valesky?
No comments or questions.
Thank you. Commissioner Majori?
I have no additional comments, thank you. I'll be voting yes.
Okay, thank you. So my vote is in favor of the recommendations on the consent agenda. Commissioner Berman, you're voting?
I'm voting yes, except 162 and 164. I'm concurring. Thank you.
Thank you. Commissioner Alisi?
Yes on all items.
Thank you. Commissioner Edwards?
Yes on all items.
Thank you. Commissioner Howard?
Yes on all items except for a recusal on item 362.
Thank you. Commissioner Valesky?
Yes on all items.
And Commissioner Majori?
Yes on all items. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. The items are approved and the recommendations adopted. Madam Secretary, is there anything else further coming before us today?
There's nothing further today.
Excellent. Thank you that. And with that, we adjourn today's session. Thank you, everyone, for your time and participation.